Probably torture level.
Yeah. Okay, so the unit of analysis is going to be the regime, and we're going to have a variable that we describe as eversign, which is a binary indicator that takes the value of 1 if the regime is if the regime is ever a signatory of the cat, and we're going to estimate essentially the hazard rate. That is to try and find, we're going to estimate the hazard rate by looking at eversign and the number of days in which the government is being in office. We're going to use the Cox proportional hazard model. We're going to run interactions between eversign and the regime type, but that doesn't change the results, and what you get is essentially this. So the reported coefficients here are not the hazard ratios. All right. When we see a coefficient of 0 here, what it means is that the variable in question has no effect on the hazard rate. A negative coefficient is going to imply that an increase in the variable reduces the hazard rate, and a positive coefficient means that it increases the hazard rate. And here is whether or not you've ever signed the cat, and these are different torture data series. Okay, this is Hathaway's. This is the Signorelli and Richards torture data series. And you can see that indeed the eversign variable is negative and significant across all possible data sets, in suggesting that indeed signing the cat reduces the probability of regime failure or increases the likelihood of the government surviving in office. All right. We can see that when we include torture, there's not much effect. We've got a couple of other variables that we've included. The number of changes in the executive. That seems to be positive and significant. So the executive may change in office, but the regime doesn't fall necessarily. And a couple of other things that are not terribly significant. Resources don't seem to matter. Population size doesn't matter. Correlates of war capabilities doesn't matter. GDP barely matters. And so what we were concerned about on the first run through is that some regimes, or some leaders come to power, and they don't actively sign the cat, they inherit their signatory status. We were concerned that a previous autocratic leader had signed the cat, and that therefore their status as a signatory doesn't have the same informational weight that it would be if an autocratic leader actually went ahead and signed the thing. So we dropped regimes from the data set that inherited their signatory status, and the results are much stronger. Okay? So suggesting that indeed this informational role may well be more important. The sign rate is negative, increases in significance. Okay, now in a second set of regressions, we now do what we call a multiple record analysis, where the unit of analysis now is the regime and the year. Okay? And we're essentially now looking at the time between the current year and the year the regime took office, and once again trying to explain what the hazard rate might actually be. And the explanatory variable here is whether or not you signed the cat in the previous year. Okay? And we're going to use a proportional hazards model. And instead of putting up a table, what we can do is we can plot this results of this set of regressions here. And what you see is this, that we have here is the years in office of the regime, right? And we can have the probability what is that? That's the hazard rate. So that's the probability that you fail, that the regime is evicted from office. And you can see very, very clearly that if you sign the cat, the probability to get thrown out of office is significantly lower at all periods of holding office. That is the case if you're a non-signatory. Okay? So that's with the Siri data. With the Hathaway data, same result emerges. Okay? So that's simply using a survival analysis or a duration analysis on the data. We might be concerned about other issues of selection and endogeneity. So what we've also done, and this is all a bit technical, but is that we've pre-processed the data and we've matched it using propensity score matching. Essentially now what we do is for every data point or for every regime or regime year that's in the data set, we try to find a signatory and a non-signatory that are otherwise very, very similar. Okay? And so we're going to throw out some observations and keep others, essentially. When we do the propensity score matching, our results are robust and indeed stand up very, 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 very clearly. We've tested whether or not the proportional hazards model is appropriate, and indeed, we see no reason to reject the hypothesis that there is a time effect and the duration matters. We've run Weibull models rather than Cox models, and that hasn't made any effect. We've also considered that maybe fragile authoritarian regimes are somewhat different from other kinds of regimes, and so we dropped all observations that were that survived less than a year or less than 2 years from the estimation procedure. And again, the results are nice and clear and robust. And so we've essentially cranked the data in a variety of different ways. And invariably, we find exactly the same result that is consistent with our observations. That is that the worst torturers are the ones that sign, and the signers stay in office longer than the ones that don't. Are there any questions about the details? Because I want to, in the process of concluding, I'm going to try and talk a little more broadly about the human rights regime and sort of questions that this work might actually raise. Yeah?
Just a quick question about controls. You have a slide that goes through your...
Well, I flipped through them pretty fast. So there's the key variable. This is all one table. I just couldn't fit it on one slide. Okay? So I've included the levels of torture. I've included whether or not there are changes in the chief executive in that year, whether there's a civilian chief executive, whether there is an opposition party, how many parties are operative, whether this is a resource-dependent, or the level of resource dependence for the regime or for the regime year, depending upon the regression, the population, and so on.
Any regional dummies or country dummies? I'm just thinking about cultural differences in sort of attitudes about international law and contract enforcement in general.
No. I mean, we didn't explore any of that. Remember, we only have about 129 regimes in the first place. So we are reluctant to add more controls to the story. Perhaps in the multiple record analysis we could do that. We haven't explored regional variation.
That would be important. I mean, just in terms of sort of cultural differences in enforceability of contracts and attitudes about sort of
remember that here our presumption is that there's no enforcement of the contracts in the current period. It's all sort of expectation of what had happened in the distant future if you fall down, if you get removed from office and have to leave. So in that sense, I'm not expecting the government to be responding to current cultural norms about enforcement. Yeah.
One more time about the period. I just can't get rid of it in my head. So you're selecting on 1985 to 1996. Now this is also during the time. I mean, so you're looking at essentially the fall of the Soviet Union, and these countries that are in your sample, you have ex-Soviet clients, right? So now that they've lost their patron, they have a decision to make. They either go in line with the international community and they sign, or they don't. And it seems to me that it's no surprise that signatories to the conventions, and I'm assuming that since we're looking at the authoritarian regimes, heavily developing countries, that they would be more likely to torture more because the U.S. has their back. So if the U.S. has my back, I'll go along with whatever the international charade is, and I'll keep on doing what I need to do. If you extend the series though to let's say 2005, then we might see what are the impacts on the regime survival. But just looking at 1995, I mean that's essentially where all these democratic transitions took place.
I'm not sure I fully follow your logic about the fall of the Soviet Union having an impact here. There's no question that there was a lot of democratization over this period because of the fall of the end of the Cold War. But if anything, that should bias us against our finding, right? If there's a lot of democratization going on, right, and these are the guys that signed the CAT, Yeah?
Well, I'm not
Okay,
clear as to
then in fact, that should buy us